Since when did the truth become a problem for people? It seems the truth is up for sale in some circles. Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. With a U.S. election less than a month away and a Canadian election, federal election on the horizon next year, the misinformation and disinformation is rampant. The FBI has shut down Tenet Media in Tennessee, which was run by two Canadians, because it was discovered that the Russian-owned RT channel was funneling money to Tenet to amplify its pro-Trump stance. That's called propaganda, and it has massive implications for our democracy. Our Unpublished.vote question asks, should attempts by foreign agents to sway voters in an election be considered an attack on a nation? Yes, no, or unsure. You can log on and vote right now. Don't forget to email your MP afterwards using our tool to tell them why you think what you do. All comments on the unpublished.ca website will be entered into our draw for a one-year membership to unpublished.ca. Joining us to discuss the problem of misinformation and disinformation will be Marcus Kolga, director of DisinfoWatch, as well Lori Turnbull of Dalhousie University will bring her views. But first, I'm pleased to be joined by Yuri Novodvorsky. He is one of the directors of the Russian-Canadian Democratic Alliance. And Yuri, currently the federal investigation into foreign interference in our elections came to the conclusion that, quote, Russia was likely not a threat, unquote. Should that be revisited in light of the Tenet Media Russia Today connection?
Thanks, Ed. We believe that it absolutely should be revisited, and we've filed letters with the commission to that effect, that we would like them to reassess and comment on the recent revelations regarding the allegations with Tenet Media. We think that it is an indicator that Russia has been involved in cognitive warfare with Canada for many years now. And when you ask if this is a form of warfare, I would say absolutely. I think many Canadians are familiar with information warfare. So cognitive warfare is a level beyond that. It seeks to manipulate or control how people react to that information and weaken society from within.
You know, I'm wondering, is there a lack of ability by investigators looking into this? Because it took quite a while for them to find something on this Tenet Media. And, you know, RT has been around for quite a while. It just seems that they've been operating and doing, you know, pushing this information out. And it doesn't seem to be getting a serious investigation. Do you feel that way?
That's a great question, Ed, and one that we've posed to government officials every chance we get, because this is not the first time that we have seen in the media allegations of Canadians collaborating with Russia. Tenet Media is an example of media disinformation. There have been previous news reports of Canadian nationals violating sanctions, and all of these investigations are revealed from the United States. So we don't know if Canada is cooperating with these investigations behind the scenes or simply not conducting them. And so we are pushing the government to do more in investigation, but also to be more transparent about what's going on.
Yeah, you know, your presentation of the commission found that there was a lack of focus on Russia, and considering the past, and in particular since 2014 and the invasion of Crimea, why do you think that is?
Multiple times, Canadian government officials have said that they have no evidence of Russian attempts to influence Canadian elections or launch disinformation campaigns. We clearly see now that this is false. You know, the Tenet Media allegations show this to be false. So the question is, were Canadian officials really completely unaware of this? Because if so, they need to revisit their assumptions. Or were they simply not transparent for whatever investigative reasons?
What does Russia and specifically Vladimir Putin want from this type of interference?
Thank you, Ed. Yeah, this is a question that is often asked. What is the purpose of Russian disinformation campaigns? And of course, there's a primary goal of increasing support for Russian strategic interests, such as weakening support for Ukraine We see this now with, over time, less and less support for Western aid to Ukraine, despite, or rather, because of Russian disinformation campaigns. But there is a secondary goal to these propaganda campaigns, and that's to destabilize Canadian society by reducing trust in democratic institutions. Many of the news bits that are shared by foreign Russian disinformation accounts, they're not just pushing anti-Ukraine news, they're pushing news that's against Canadian government officials, against media, professionals, and science, because over time, this moves Canadians to more and more extreme positions. And the end goal for Russia is a nation that's functioning at a lower level and is less able to respond in times of crisis. And I don't think this is just a hypothetical situation. I feel like we've seen this play out in the United States, where the country was less able to put together a coherent COVID-19 response during the pandemic, which led to a much higher death rate than in many other comparable countries.
You know, Yuri, Canada has the largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world, and Canada is clearly on the side of Ukraine. It also is a sizable voting bloc, in particular West. What's the end goal here of Russia when there are so many Canadians that seem, and Canadians' financial support behind Ukraine?
I think this would be a very good question to ask representatives of the Ukrainian community, but my guess would be that with its large Ukrainian community, Canada should be one of the staunchest supporters of Ukraine while it's trying to fend off this invasion. So I believe that Russia is probably using its efforts to try to weaken that support. And I think we're seeing that from some partisan politicians trying to build up critique that is not substantiated and weakening support for Ukraine.
Yuri, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ed. I'm happy to be here. Appreciate the invitation.
Yuri Novodvorsky is one of the directors of the Russian-Canadian Democratic Alliance. Misinformation and disinformation, are they the same? How do they sway people? Marcus Kolga is a director with Disinfowatch, and he joins us now. And Marcus, what's the difference between the two?
Well, thanks for having me on, Ed. Well, there's a big difference between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is basically it's false information. It could be erroneously reported information, but it's information that's not intended to mislead. Whereas disinformation is basically lies, false information, fake news, as it were, that is created intentionally with the intent to mislead audiences. So a big difference between misinformation and disinformation.
And which is more effective to its goal?
It depends. Again, misinformation can mislead. This could be, perhaps a news report that has a mistake in it, perhaps a slip of the tongue. So again, it's not intended to mislead people. Can it mislead? Absolutely. Disinformation, on the other hand, might be as vast as a conspiracy theory. It could be a small lie that's injected into our information environment. And we have seen the impact of disinformation in our information environment for the past, 10 years. It is having an impact. It is causing confusion within our information environment. It is misleading and deceiving Canadians. And we see that the actors that are behind the creation and amplification of disinformation are only intensifying their operations, whether it's foreign governments or morally corrupt political opportunists within Canada itself.
And how do they, manipulate our democracy?
Well, I mean, there are several ways that they do it, and it's depending on who the actor is, but often it's done by, if we're looking at an actor like Russia, for example, what they are actively doing is monitoring our political environment, our information environment. They're looking for the most polarizing issues within society. And so once they identify one of these issues, what they will do is that they will use various different platforms, techniques, including state media, sometimes their own diplomats, but also influencers who might be aligned with their objectives. They may even be influencers who are paid by the Russian government to inject narratives on both sides of an issue. So, we can sort of simplify it by saying the far left and the far right. They'll inject narratives into that information environment on both of those sides to pull apart, to further divide Canadians on those issues. And so they've been doing this for quite some time, and unfortunately, it seems like they're quite effective at that in those operations.
What are the consequences, if any, for the willing spread of misinformation or disinformation? I guess in terms of misinformation, like you said, it could be an accident, something unhonest thing. But for the willing spread of disinformation, what are the consequences?
Well, look, let's go back to misinformation. I mean, when a newspaper, a media outlet, mistakenly makes a mistake in their reporting, there's an editorial process to correct that mistake. They will publish corrections when those mistakes are identified. In terms of disinformation, there really isn't too much of a consequence. Domestically, we do have freedom of expression enshrined in our laws. It's a cornerstone of our democratic society. And so Canadians are free to say what they wish. They are free to express their opinions, whether that's based on facts or complete falsehoods. Canadians are allowed to believe that the world is flat. They're allowed to tell their neighbors that they believe that the world is flat. But that doesn't mean that we're free from scrutiny. So that means that when someone does, try to convince you that the world is flat, you can push back. And this is something that we need to be doing more of, is, identifying those sorts of narratives, pushing back on them with facts and truth. When it comes to foreign influence operations, countries like Russia, Iran, and China, who try to essentially, what they're doing is weaponizing information to try and deceive us and manipulate our information environment. There also are very few consequences for them, unfortunately, at the current moment. They can pretty much operate in this country, try to, again, manipulate our information environment with relative impunity. Now, we do have sanctions sanctioning legislation that we could be using, especially for those Canadians who are willfully collaborating and perhaps generating some sort of income or benefit from that collaboration. We should be looking at those individuals and investigating them. But on a whole, these foreign governments, these foreign authoritarian governments, are able to operate with relative ease in this country, and again, without much consequence.
Sometimes the disinformation is so out there that it's hard to believe, but there are still some people who do. Are there any characteristics that are similar in those folks who are believing that really hard to believe stuff?
Well, I mean, there are a few. I mean, we just ran a poll in the late spring with the Canadian Digital Media Research network, and we polled Canadians specifically on Russian narratives about the war in Ukraine. And what we found, quite remarkably, was that the majority of Canadians have actually been exposed to Russian disinformation narratives about the war. And so you have to ask, how is that possible? How are most Canadians being exposed to this? And what we also found was that a majority of Canadians who are specifically on the sort of far right of the political spectrum, that they were far more susceptible to these narratives. They either believed them or were unable to identify Russian disinformation narratives. So, it clearly indicates that we need to be doing much more work to raise awareness of these sorts of operations, and through that awareness to build resilience too. Because right now, clearly, Canadians they're being exposed to these narratives, and they are vulnerable to them.
Marcus, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Ed.
Marcus Kolga is a director with DisinfoWatch. Our Unpublished.vote question asks, should attempts by foreign agents to sway voters in an election be considered an attack on a nation? Yes, no, or unsure. You can log on and vote right now. And don't forget to email your MP afterwards using our tool to tell them why you think what you do. All comments to the Unpublished.ca website will be entered into a draw for a one-year membership to Unpublished.ca. Lori Turnbull is with the Faculty of Management at Dalhousie University and is a frequent contributor to the cafe, and she joins us now. And Lori, what are your concerns about democracy when there's rampant efforts to undermine it through misinformation and disinformation?
Okay, so I'm going to focus on the domestic part of this, not the foreign interference side. And I'm going to talk about how difficult it is for people to know what is true and what is not true. I think lying has always been a part of politics, misrepresenting, taking some liberties with the truth, trying to put things in a certain light. I think that has always been an aspect of how political communication has gone. But now I think because of the way we are being presented with so much information, it's hard to know. It's hard to verify. It's hard to be sure. And it makes voters feel, I think, like they have an even greater challenge in terms of building civic literacy because they're not sure if they can trust what they're reading.
I can understand that part. When we've got finger pointing going on, in Parliament, in the House of Commons, is it really a safe prospect for leaders or MPs to be politicizing such misinformation or disinformation?
Well, okay. I think that when people are deciding now whether they want to go into politics, whether they want to run for political office, it's hard enough. Like there are so many reasons why that's a hard decision to make. And having this on top of it, knowing in advance that you are going to have to deal with accusations and allegations and things that are being, bandied around about you and about what you believe in, that you're going to have to try to disprove or deal with or respond to or not and try to ride it out. It brings a level of chaos, and it's a burden for people who want to be in politics and who want to kind of wade through all that garbage and do something real. It's like one more thing that you have to deal with, and it's a cost that I think a lot of people are probably not going to want to carry. In terms of the political leaders, we see all sorts of things going on. I think the leaders have always been a big focus in politics, but now I think we're even more than ever, the leaders are the brand of the parties. And so trying to get at a leader's reputation is like political blood sport, right? It's not, the liberals aren't the liberals like they used to be. These are the Trudeau liberals. And the Polyev conservatives are not the same as the Harper conservatives. fine. Every leader is going to have their own brand, but now the parties' reputations and brands are really, really defined by the leaders. And so I think that has given way to a more politicized, a more personalized kind of political attack. And if you can kind of get a strike on a leader, the parties they go for blood at that point, right? Because then you're really kind of taking down that brand of the party because it's the leader. And I don't think we always see political leaders necessarily, standing up and say, hey, look, we want to keep this clean. We kind of we see them kind of letting these kinds of accusations fly. We don't hear political leaders come out and say, take a united front and say, we don't want to see any of this hostility. We don't want to see misinformation and disinformation. We want to see a good, clean fight. The leaders don't say that. And so, if the leaders don't say it, then why would we expect anything to change?
You had mentioned about there's so much information, misinformation, disinformation out there. It's hard to know what's real and what isn't. But at some point, Canadians have to start paying attention. When we have so few voting in elections because it's too much to think about or too inconvenient, should we really be surprised we're in this situation?
It's true. I mean, I think democracy works really well when it is a competition of ideas. And the best ideas that get the most support will float to the top. And the ones that are not as successful, they don't convince enough people. They're not, they're kind of on the fringes. They will be flushed out by the system. But that only happens if enough people participate. That only happens if you've got all kinds of people buying in. And even if you don't feel passionately about any of the people who are running, and you don't necessarily think that any of them is, the savior who's going to come and fix everything. If you come in and you pay attention, you get informed, you listen to the different people who are running, and you make a decision, that helps to keep that democratic system alive. It keeps the filtering process alive. And if people aren't paying attention and people aren't getting involved, and you got that whole kind of center or middle, or that kind of center of gravity that keeps things in check, when that's not as active and that's not coming out, then those fringe ideas that would typically be discarded are not. They're rising to the top. And then the political leaders who want to court votes, they start giving some oxygen to those ideas, and they start floating those trial balloons out there that actually, you listen to what some political leaders say, and it's like, who are they talking to when they say that? That's not a centrist mainstream idea. Most Canadians aren't going to agree with that. And it's true, but they don't care, because most Canadians aren't listening. They're sending these ideas out to identify with those small pockets of the population who may be persuaded by this, who might like to hear nasty messages about the opponent, who might want to even give money in the event that they think that somebody is onto something, and hey, I like that idea, and then they send $30 or whatever. Like, we are really in a world where political leaders are no longer trying to build a vision for lots of people to come under. They're appealing to those kind of sometimes fringe ideas, sometimes just kind of not mainstream, not most people. They're kind of appealing to smaller pockets.
Do you see misinformation and disinformation as protected as free speech under the Charter?
Well, I think the legal definition of that is one thing. And I think, for example, there was a case brought against the government a couple of years ago because the federal government tried to prohibit lying in politics, particularly as it lies that related to political leaders. And so making false claims, like, for example, saying that a political leader or a candidate had committed a crime that they didn't. Like, they were trying to put that into law. They did put that into law, and it was challenged. And that part of the law was struck down because of this issue of free speech. Because when you start saying, you're not allowed to say this, you're not allowed to say that, it gets into censorship. The way the law was worded at the time was like, even if the person doesn't necessarily mean to be spreading disinformation, it's still against the law. That makes it really difficult. It's hard to legalize and regulate that sort of thing because it easily gets into censorship. And then who's the one deciding whether it's a lie? And it's not, and oftentimes this misinformation and disinformation, it's not necessarily the case that somebody is going to come out and say, Ed Hand committed this crime. It's going to be more sleight of hand. It's going to be more like kind of nuanced and take an idea that, might have a grain of truth to it, but then, let kind of coax it a little bit and let people think what they want. And that's the kind of stuff that's going to be harder to prove and harder to really get at, especially with a legal or a regulatory tool. And so it really relies on that democratic culture to, again, purge those ideas and purge the tactics that are toxic. And we don't see that happening right now.
Yeah, libel, death threats, threats in general, not covered under the Constitution. I'm kind of wondering why this would be, or under the Charter, why this would be allowed in this situation. It doesn't make any sense. Or is this just, in terms of libel, and I've been in the broadcast business for a long time, we know exactly what you can and can't say without, looking at a legal situation.
Yeah.
It seems politicians don't seem that way at all.
That's a really, really good point. Like, there, in other scenarios, in other work environments, in other professions, there is a sense that there's a line and you can't cross that line. You can't just go on TV and say whatever the heck you want about somebody. Like, there's going to be a consequence. And it seems like those sorts of parameters are not being held up in politics. And I think that there is a kind of extra concern around censorship, especially because in a political environment, you have one party that is the government. The government is a party, right? And so there's a sense that when that government starts to make rules about what can you say and what you cannot say, are they doing that with a partisan lens? Are they doing that because they want to make sure that they're protected? And are they going to be trusted to be the ones to make the decision about what can be said and what not when they are both the government and a partisan player?
Yeah, I can see that, but I guess in that situation, you need something that's all party to agree on it.
Yeah, well, exactly, right. And you, in an ideal world, we would have those sorts of mechanisms, and we would have it would be possible. But now it's hard to imagine the parties agreeing on what temperature it is outside, let alone what
Yeah.
approach to take to, how to regulate their own behavior, their own communication, in order to make sure that there's still a safe space. And people are using the safe space all the time, but like there's a reason, there's a really important justification for why we should make sure that there is a safe place for a meaningful exchange of ideas in a democracy, or else it's not going to work. These are not just nice ideas. Like, we are now to a point where we're watching a parliament totally eat itself alive. They're not getting anything done in there. All because it's like, nope, the Conservatives want their election. The Bloc doesn't want to give up what they've got. Now, I don't blame them. They're finally relevant after 2.5 years. They can finally make the government. Like, I wouldn't want to leave either if I were Blanchet. And Trudeau's pretending he's got a chance, and he doesn't. And the NDP have blown it because they've spent the last 2.5 years backing up the Liberals, and now they want to be taken seriously as an opposition party. Like, come on. And meanwhile, Canadians are getting no value from this.
No. And it just seems politics these days, it's not about the country. It's not about the election. It's more like cheering for your hometown sports team. Win at all costs, and that's all that matters.
Yeah.
We've kind of lost it, haven't we?
Well, that's it, right? And now there's more of a sense that the opposite team is somehow the enemy rather than just the opponent, right? Like, they are bad for the country. They have bad ideas. There's all these bad things are going to happen if they're elected. And again, we've always had fear tactics in politics too. There's always been a sense, don't vote for them, or the economy's going to be a mess, or they're going to sell us to the US, or whatever scare tactic, fill in the blank. But now there seems to be a lack of decency in how the politicians are interacting with one another. There's no, okay, well, look, we're all good people at the end of the day, and we're going to shake hands and go for a beer, and all of the arguments we're having are in good faith. It seems that good faith isn't there anymore, even though they all keep calling each other honorable members.
Laurie, I'm going to leave the honorable members as the last word from you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you too.
Laurie Turnbull is with the Faculty of Management at Dalhousie University. Our Unpublished.vote question asks, should attempts by foreign agents to sway voters in an election be considered an attack on a nation? Yes, no, or unsure. You can log on and vote right now. And don't forget to email your MP afterwards using our tool to tell them why you think what you do. All comments on the Unpublished.ca website will be entered into a draw for a 1-year membership to Unpublished.ca. I want to thank our guests today on the Unpublished Cafe, Yuri Novodvorsky, Marcus Kolga, and Laurie Turnbull. And thank you for watching the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.